is Abby Askins, and my capstone project is titled Impact of Morphology Instruction on Vocabulary Knowledge. The research topic centers around morphology instruction, and the reason I wanted to focus on this for my capstone project was that students are constantly learning new vocabulary words, especially across all content areas, starting as young as preschool into kindergarten. And also the small guided reading groups that I did during this intervention is a crucial component of Reader's Workshop, where I can really focus in on the morphology instruction and those word parts of our vocabulary words. And that links to vocabulary knowledge, and that is a important component that can help students then comprehend a text. So once they learn the morphemes of the vocabulary words that we are talking about, then that'll help them with the definition of the word. And then once they can define the vocabulary words within the book, then that will better suit them to comprehend the text. And then it is also one thing I wanted to focus on was that it's not just the memorization of words, but when they can really break the words down into the morphemes, then they are understanding how to recognize a word using all of the parts of their brain. The research problem statement states, students in the researcher's second grade class struggle with understanding key vocabulary words in a given text. This phenomenon impacts the student's learner's ability to understand meaning of vocabulary words while reading a text. Having this knowledge will help students comprehend the text using the vocabulary knowledge they acquired while reading. The possible cause of this problem is that the students may not have enough background knowledge of the vocabulary words, are English language learners and speak a different language at home, or need more explicit morphology instruction to guide them in understanding word parts. The research question states, how does morphology instruction impact students' understanding of key vocabulary words in a given text? The product that is associated with my action research project is an instructional intervention, and this was a small group focused intervention that included modeling and then guided practice. And with guided practice, students were given morphology passages that focused on specific affixes. And so for the first week, we focused on a prefix, and for the second week, we focused on a suffix. And then with some of the modeling, I also included some other common prefixes and suffixes that students might see throughout the passages or just in their everyday reading. And we did a lot of modeling, or I did a lot of modeling with sentence stems. And so what I would do is I would write the words out onto a sentence strip, and I would cut apart the prefix with the base word, or the base word and the suffix. And students were able to see that once they learned the definition of the affix, then they could put it together with the base word, and that helped them to visualize and then also understand the meaning of the whole vocabulary word. And so then students did that themselves with sentence strips, and that was part of the independent practice that they did. And then they also were able to highlight the vocabulary words in the morphology passages that had the affixes, the prefix of in, and then the suffix of ly. And then the product also included pre-tests that students took at the beginning of the week, and then post-tests that they took at the end of the instruction at the end of each week. The methodology used was quantitative research method, and the reason I wanted to choose quantitative was because I wanted to collect numerical data for how my students were understanding the idea of morphemes and my use of morphology instruction to help students understand vocabulary words that they will have in their passages. And the data collection was through pre-tests and post-tests, which I will get to more in the next slide. And my participants included 5 of my second grade students. I collected data through pre-tests and post-tests. Each test throughout both weeks were the same for the pre-test and the post-test. And they had 10 questions total on both of them. The top half were 5 matching questions where students had to match the affixes. I had a mix up of prefixes and suffixes, and they had to match those to the definitions. And then the second half were 5 short answer questions where students were writing the definition of vocabulary words that they found in their passages. And we practiced using those words by highlighting as well as on our sentence strips, and students were then asked to write the definition. And so both the pretest and the post-test were the same, just so I could collect the data to see how students grew from the pretest to the post-test. In order to analyze the data, I used descriptive statistics, where I was looking at the mean and calculating the mean from the pretest and the post-test. I went ahead and broke it down by questions for matching and for the short answer to see how students did on the pretest and then how they grew on the post-test. And the mean statistics can really help me describe the impact that the morphology instruction had on my students' understanding of key vocabulary words. And so I also broke down those averages by each student and how they did the averages of the pretest and the averages of their post-test, which I will show in a table below. Here is the first graph where I am looking at week 1 of the matching questions. And so at the bottom, you can see the affixes that we focused on. We had the prefix in, we had the suffix ed, we had the suffix less, we had the prefix anti, and we had the prefix tele. And so as you can see, the students on the pretest, only 1 got the prefix in correct, 2 got the suffix of the definition ed correct, nobody correctly matched the definition to the suffix less. 1 student for both prefix of anti and prefix of tele were able to match to their definitions correctly. And then on the post-test, the data shows that all students correctly matched the affixes to the definition correctly. This graph shows the week 2 matching data, and so I went ahead and looked at both week 1 and week 2, just the matching for right now. And the week 2 affixes that students were focusing on were the suffix ing, the prefix con, the suffix ly, the prefix pro, and the prefix non. And so looking at the table, 3 out of the 5 students correctly could match the definition of ing, the ing suffix, and then 1 student was able to match the correct definition of con. 0 out of 5 students were able to tell me what ly meant by matching to the definition. 1 student was able to tell me the correct definition of what pro means, the prefix, and 2 students were able to correctly match the definition to the prefix non. The next 2 slides show the data for the short answer questions. So to start with week 1, the students were asked to define the words invisible, insane, occurred, incredible, and decided. And the morphology passage focused on the prefix in, and then we also were focusing on the suffix ed because that is a common suffix that we discuss in 2nd grade. And 4 students were able to correctly define invisible, and then 1 student for each insane, incredible, and decided were able to correctly define those words, and then no students were able to define occurred correctly on the pretest. And then if you look at the post-test data, all 5 students were able to define invisible correctly. 4 students could define insane and decided correctly, and then 3 students were able to define occurred and incredible correctly. As for the data for week 2 for the short answer, the words that we focused on mainly focused on the suffix ly, and so the words at the bottom were carefully, silently, rustling, happily, and gratefully. And I also looked at rustling with the ing suffix, since that is a common ending that we see in 2nd grade as well. And 2 students for both carefully and silently were able to define those on the prefix. No students were able to define wrestling, and then one student for happily and gratefully were able to define those words on the pretest. And then for the post-test, 3 students were able to define carefully correctly. 5 students were able to define silently and happily correctly. And then 3 students were able to define wrestling and gratefully correctly. This table shows the student averages for all of the 4 tests that they took. And so looking at student 1, the combined pretest average for this student was 10%, and then student 1 was able to climb to an 80% for a combined of the post-test average. Student 2 had a combined pretest average of 25%, and it increased to 90% for the post-test average. Student 3 had a combined 35% average score for pretest and was able to climb to a 90% post-test average score. Student 4 scored a 15% for both pretest and climbed to an 85% for post-test average score. And then student 5 combined pretest average score was a 40%, and they increased to a 95% for the post-test average. So after reviewing all of the data, the results show that students could identify the meaning of several affixes and use that knowledge to define vocabulary words 76% of the time. And so while that's not 100%, it does show an increase from the pretest. And so morphology instruction had an impact, a positive impact, because students' average scores grew from their pretest to their post-test. And then the results also show that scores were higher on the matching questions, where students were asked to match the definition of the affixes to their correct definition, versus the short answer questions, where some students still needed some guidance for how to correctly define the vocabulary words and if they truly knew what those definitions meant. One conclusion I made after analyzing the data was that the teaching of morphology instruction positively impacts students' vocabulary knowledge. And the reason that I can make this conclusion is that the quantitative data showed that all participants increased in vocabulary knowledge after receiving explicit morphology instruction. And the pretest scores show that students had room to grow, and then the post-test scores showed that all students did increase in their averages. One strength of this action research project was the instructional intervention product. I believe that students, being in a small group setting, were really engaged in the activities that we were doing, and I was able to model using the sentence strips as well as looking at the morphology passages that we were using. And students were engaged with one another when they were able to write on the sentence strips and cut up those words into their morphemes, or the smaller word parts. And they were able to kinesthetically move those around and then use those as a visual to help them understand the definition of the words. And then they were also highlighting the passages and highlighting those vocabulary words that we were focusing on, as well as practicing on their whiteboards and writing down the affixes and their definitions, and then also taking that knowledge and putting those words into sentences and writing the definitions of those vocabulary words. And so I believe the instructional intervention was a strength of this action research project. And then for the weakness, I believe the data collection instrument could use some improvements. The type of questions at the beginning with the matching, I thought the students, it was helpful because I was able to see if students understood the definition of the prefixes that we were focusing on, as well as the suffixes. The only area that I think could use some improvement were the short answer questions where students had to write the definition. One example would be, I was noticing when students wrote insane, some of the definitions they would put were just not sane. And I want to follow up with my students to see if they know what not sane means. So more morphologically, they define the word correctly, But now I want to take it another step further, and I think that this data collection instrument could have had another component where I was able to see if they, once they wrote not sane, if they could then tell me, well, what does not sane mean? And so I think the data collection instrument maybe just needed one more aspect. There are two influential factors that I found throughout this intervention. And the first one would be the length. And the students participated in this intervention for 10 days. And it was right after getting back into the swing of things after winter break, where students were just trying to get back into that routine, trying to get back into the small groups that we've been working in. And so I believe that this could be one factor where students were just trying to adjust after winter break. And then the second factor would be absentee. I had one student who was sick one day, and so I had to catch that student up the next day. And so I believe that this could just be one factor where that student maybe felt like they missed out or felt rushed when they were being caught up the next day. Actually, I think it would be important to further investigate using an intervention that's done with the same students, but also for a longer period of time. I would be curious to see if these students truly understood more of the definition of some of the vocabulary words that we were working with taking it kind of one step further, where of the example I used before with insane, where students were combining and doing a good job of combining the definition of the prefix or suffix. So for in would be not, and then putting that with the base or root word. So insane would be not sane. And so I think if there was a little bit extra or a longer period of time for that data collection, I think that would be a good thing to further investigate to see if students could understand the definition on a deeper level. And then I also think it'd be interesting to see the intervention with a whole class, and that would help collect a larger sample size of the data for the pre-test and the post-test.